Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shelf Life. This is Simran, and this is my podcast, Shelf Life, where we talk about books, their philosophies, but most importantly, our personal relationship with the book. Today's episode is not going to be a podcast. It's not going to be me talking about my stories and you talking about yours. It's going to be a little bit different. I'm dedicating this episode to celebrating Dalit literature. We're going to be talking about stories written by Dalit men and women that talk about Dalit experience, and we're going to be discussing poetry written by Dalit women and a lot more stuff. And before we get into the recommendations, I want to make it very clear that this is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot more literature out there. There's a lot more books out there that talk about this particular subject. There's a lot more information you can get if you want to really read up about Dalit experience. So this is just a little list that I made of books that I've read and the books that I feel would um, fit well for this episode. So I'm putting them here. But there's a lot more literature out there, and I urge you to read it. And one last thing, I just want to make it very clear: this is an episode meant for you to meant to encourage you to read more Dalit literature, to educate yourself. In fact, that's what I want to talk about. This episode is about you and me educating ourselves. If you are someone who is economically privileged, if you are someone who's not a Dalit, if you're someone who has any sort of influence or is in a position of power, this video, I hope, encourages you to question your beliefs, to question what you know is right and wrong. I hope you examine yourself. I hope you examine your traditions, the way you do things, the way that you perceive the people around you. I hope this episode encourages you to have healthy conversations with people around you, with people who work for you, people who you talk to on a daily basis. And more than anything, I really, really hope that this video encourages you to educate yourself and listen. Let's get into it. The first book that I want to talk about today is a book called Chemmeen by T.S. Pillai. Now, this one is a classic in Malayalam. Wow. This one is a classic in Malayalam literature. That took a while to say, but this one's a classic, and it's been rewritten and translated a million times. But um, the most famous one, I believe, is by Anand. And Chemmeen is a story about a girl who belongs to the fishing community of Kerala, but um, it's also about fishing communities in general. I think it a lot of the traditions and customs that is talked about in this book apply to fishing communities across the field, and it's a book that has a lot of romance in it because there's a story about the protagonist falling in love with a Muslim man, and then that she's married off by her family, and there's this cute little love triangle that happens. But this is a book that talks about the fishing community of Kerala, and when I read it, it really opened my eyes up. So I encourage you to read Chemmeen by T.S. Pillai. The next book that I want to talk about is Untouchable by Mulk Anand. If you guys are fans of literature, and if you've been reading a lot of literature that's written post partition and post independence, you would know that this is a book that is highly acclaimed. It's being taught in schools and colleges. I had it as a part of my semester, so I know that this is a really influential book, and it talks about the Dalit community in India. And there is a lot of criticism with regards to its portrayal of the protagonist, Baka, but I still encourage you to read it because it has a certain amount of credibility, and I urge you to make decisions for yourself. The next book that I want to talk about is an autobiography. It's written by Mr. Kancha, Ilaiah, and it's called Why I Am Not a Hindu. And this one also is being taught in colleges, and it talks about the narrator growing up in the Kuruma caste, belonging to the Kuruma caste, and him growing up alongside upper caste children, and him having the experience that he did. He talks about just his sexuality, his relationship with worship, with religion. He talks about his relationship with the upper caste children that live in his area. He also talks about a lot of the things that they were taught when they were children, and he talks about the education, the kind of education that he received. And in general, this book is really, really informative. It's not, I wouldn't say it's completely fiction or has fictional elements, but it is a really great read if you want to learn more about um, what it means to be Telugu speaking, but also at the same time not Telugu speaking. Now, if you read the book, you will know that reference. So I urge you to read it. The next book that I want to talk about is A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. Now, Rohinton Mistry is one that I've spoken about before, and I can promise you I'm going to speak about him a lot. But he is an absolute genius, and this book is an absolute genius. It's a pretty heavy one. It's really long and fat, but I can assure you it's absolutely beautiful. It's extremely tragic. It has two Dalit characters and four central characters. The two Dalit characters have a completely awe-inspiring journey. It's a journey filled with tragedy, with bravery, with courage, with beauty. And I promise you that once you read this book, you're going to be crying for the week that follows because that's what happened to me. And I'm pretty sure that's going to happen to a lot of people. So, yeah, A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. Also, another side note about this book it talks in detail, it talks at length about the emergency that happened in 1975 and the effect that that emergency had on Dalit communities, the poor community, the marginalized minorities, and just in general, the kind of events that unfolded post emergency, post the declaration of the emergency. So if you're someone who's really interested in learning about the emergency or just finding out, narratives related to that event, I would encourage you to read this one because it's pretty informative. This was it for my section for books, but there are a couple of more recommendations that I would give you. There is a man named Perumal Murugan. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him, but he writes really wonderful books, and he is known for, amplifying voices of women and who might belong to the lower community or lower caste. He's known for amplifying voices of the Dalit community, and the books that he writes are absolutely beautiful. One of them is Punnachi. The other one is One Part Woman. And there's a couple of more, but I can't remember their names. So check him out and leave them in the comments below if you have read him. Moving on to the next part of the podcast, I want to talk about Dalit poetry a little bit, especially Dalit poetry written by women. Given everything that's been happening in our country right now, I think it's important that we don't forget that Dalit women suffer more than Dalit men in many aspects. Their bodies are constantly scrutinized and attacked, and their voices are most often not heard. So, Dalit poetry written by women was something that encouraged me to listen to those narratives and listen to those stories and just absorb them and amplify them in the best way that I could. So, I'm going to be talking about a few of my favorite artists that I've come across. The first one is a woman named Aruna Munda. She wrote a poem called A Dalit Woman in the Land of Goddesses. And I want to read a little bit of it because I think it's one of the best poems I've ever read. And for me, I've read a lot of poetry, and I just, it moved me when I read this. So I'm going to read it out for you. Her eyes to dry hollows bear silent witness to hundreds of deaths of her mothers, daughters, sisters, their dreams, respect, and their bodies. Her calloused hands, her unkept hair, her cracked heels, her wrinkled hair, tell the tales of living through fears and years, of centuries and millennia, of violations and deaths. She was told that she was dirt, She was filled, and in the sacred land of thousands of goddesses, she is called a Dalit. The next one that I want to talk about is a woman named Sukirta Rani. Sukirta Rani writes primarily about the Dalit women's experience, but with respect to the attack on their bodies and their sexuality, and the way that they have been subjugated and demeaned and humiliated over the years. And she talks specifically about the Dalit woman's body. And a lot of her poems have the narrative of pain and trauma. And I want to read a couple of lines from one of her poems. At the top of the pole, planted in my vagina, the flag of our freedom shall fly, painted in the color of blood. She has another poem called Yengde, which literally means my body. And I think when I read her poems, I I couldn't relate completely because that is not an experience that I've had or will ever probably have. But it moved me and it touched me, and I'm sure that it will touch you as well. So check her out. There's also a couple of other women, one of them being Vijala Chirupad. She's a Dalit woman from Kerala, and she's been writing a lot of influential poetry over the years, and I urge you to check her out. I'm going to be linking all of these people's poems, and if there are books available online, I'm going to be putting up a link to all of them. And aside from that, I'm also going to be putting up links for a lot of videos and a lot of just um, informative articles that I've read over the couple of weeks while researching about this episode, and I'm going to be putting up all of them in the description box. So please check it out. This video is not going to be enough in itself, so I'm going to be putting up all the entire list of videos that I watched. And if I miss some out, you can always contact me. You can always text me or send an email, and I will get back to you. Now, there's a lot more that I want to talk about, but I recognize that this is not a subject that I am equipped to talk about. This is not a subject that, this is not a story that is mine to tell, and I won't attempt to. So I'm going to keep it till here for this episode, and, you know, but probably for the next episode or later on in the chat box, maybe we can talk about the genre that this kind of literature belongs to, which is traumatic materialism. I could probably talk about it a little bit later, but for this episode, I'm going to keep it till here. I just wanted to put some of the literature that I read out there. And if you are listening and if you didn't know about these books and these women, I hope that now you know and you check them out and read them for yourself. Um, for the last thing, it's just a request that I know that we are all at fault, um, especially people who are privileged like me. I know that in some way or the other, I am at fault too because we've all made mistakes. We've all been casteist without even knowing. So I'm taking this time to learn more, to listen more, to educate myself. And I really hope that you try to do this as well. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I'm going to be saying this a million times, but I'm saying this again. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can use to educate yourself, that you can listen to, that you can, there's podcasts out there, there's books. I think one book that I always recommend when I'm talking about Dalit literature, or protest literature even, is Annihilation of Caste by Mr. B.R. Ambedkar. This is a book that you can't miss, and if you haven't read it, I really urge you to read it. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the country, and this is the time to come together. It's time together to question ourselves more than we question the people who are suffering. This is the time to question our governments, to question our system, to question just our traditions and the way we've been doing things. This is the time to do a lot of self-reflection. So let's do that. I'm going to be doing my best to amplify voices. I'm going to be doing my best to pass the mic on and not take it for myself. I'm going to be doing my best to support in any way possible. And to wrap this up, I just want to say that there was a Dalit man who gave an interview once. He was called Dhiren Borisa. And when he was asked, how he protests and how he questions the system and how he fights against all the injustice that is out there that's out to get him, his answer was very simple. He said, "The only way I can question the system is to be there. My presence is how I resist." I encourage you to resist, and I encourage you to be there, to listen, to show up, to educate, to organize, and to agitate. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.